The dust in the Arizona Territory did not settle. It just moved from one desperate patch of ground to another. In the late 1870s, this was the way of things in Dry Well. The town was a raw gash of lumber and grit, clinging to a rail line that was still more rumor than reality. The law was a thin coat of paint on sun-warped wood. Underneath, the old conflicts over land and water simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. At the edge of this territory, Eleanor Hart, known to most as Ellie, stood watching the wind tear at a loose slat on her fence. She was 28 years old, a widow for 2 of those years, and she felt as dry and scoured as the land itself. Her ranch, once Jacob's pride, was failing. The horses were too few and too thin, and the well, the one that gave the town its hopeful name, had been empty for 6 months. Hope was a luxury that cost more than water. Ellie pushed a strand of hair back from her face, her hand rough against her own skin. She was tired. She was tired of the heat, tired of the wind, and tired of the memory of rain. But she was not beaten. In her pocket, her fingers closed around the single, heavy iron key to her small house. It was her last piece of solid reality, the one thing that said she belonged here. She would not go back east. She would not be the grieving daughter, the pitiful sister. This land held Jacob's bones and her own pride. She would hold it, or she would be buried in it beside him. She had to go to town. The larder was low, and she needed credit she knew she did not have. She saddled her mare, the animal's ribs a clear map of their shared hardship, and began the slow ride into Dry Well. The town was more crowded than usual for a weekday. People were gathered in the street, their voices a low, uneasy hum. Ellie guided her horse through the edge of the crowd, her eyes scanning. She saw the familiar figures of power. Silas Crowell stood on the wide porch of the Mercantile, his large frame blocking the doorway. He was a man who consumed space, who believed the vast grasslands that stretched to the mesas were his by right of appetite. He wanted her land. He wanted the grass. But more, he wanted the rights to the deep spring that he knew, that everyone knew, fed the high pastures. He was a patient man, a spider of a man, and he was watching the proceedings in the street with a look of mild interest, as if observing a new breed of cattle. Beside him, leaning against a post, was Ray Hutt. Hutt was Crowell's right hand, a man who moved with a silence that was more threatening than any loud word. He was a creature of shadow and gun oil, and his eyes, fixed on the center of the crowd, were flat and bored. From the steps of the town's small, unpainted church, the voice of Reverend Ezekiel Pike cut through the murmur. He was not shouting, not yet, but his words were sharp. He spoke of God's law and man's law, of the impurities that threatened their small flock, of the need to root out sin and savagery. He was a man who saw fear as a tool, and he used it with the skill of a master carpenter. His sermon was aimed directly at the man standing bound in the square. Ellie stopped her horse. She finally saw what had drawn the town. Sheriff McCaffrey, a man who looked like he had not slept well in a week, stood in the dust next to a man whose hands were tied in front of him. This new man was Dine, a Navajo. He was tall, though he stood with a weariness that seemed to pull at his shoulders. His black hair was long. His face was stark and proud, etched with lines of hardship and old scars from wars Ellie could only imagine. He wore the faded, ill-fitting clothes of a man who had been stripped of his own, but he wore them with a stillness that defied the crowd. This was Talhani Nez. He was called Jonah by the white men who had forced him through their schools. He looked, to Ellie, as exhausted as she felt, but his pride was a different kind, a kind that had been tempered in fire she would never know. He was a warrior. She could see that, but he was also a man hunted, a man looking for a home in a world that insisted he had none. He was seeking freedom, a place to rest his honor, and he had found this. The sheriff unrolled a piece of paper. His voice was rough, and he did not look at the man beside him. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory," he began, his voice cracking. "This man, known as Jonah Nez, having been found guilty of the theft of one horse, property of the Crowell Ranch." A lie, Ellie thought, her stomach tightening. Crowell had more horses than he could count, but he never lost one. "And," the sheriff continued, "the plaintiff, Mr. Crowell, having graciously waived a hanging in favor of compensation." Silas Crowell gave a small, magnanimous incline of his head from the porch. "We will now commence," the sheriff said, his voice dropping. "An auction for his labor. 1 year, to compensate the aggrieved party." Ellie stared. This was not justice. This was a perversion, a show staged for one man's greed. Pike was nodding, as if this were a righteous act. Hutt was watching Jonah, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Jonah himself said nothing. His eyes were not on the sheriff, nor on Crowell. He was scanning the gaps between the buildings, the alleys, the rooftops. He was not looking for mercy. He was looking for an escape. Ellie's hand, the one not holding the reins, clenched into a fist in her lap. The broken fence, the dry well, the empty larder, it all faded. Here, in the center of the street, was an injustice so plain, so cruel, that it mirrored the harshness of the land itself. A man was being sold like a beast of burden. The crowd watched, some with shame, some with excitement, but all of them silent, all of them complicit. The key in her pocket felt suddenly very cold. It was a symbol of what she had to lose. But the man in the square was a symbol of what was already lost. Sheriff McCaffrey licked his lips, the paper trembling in his hand. The sun was high, a hammer of white heat that pressed down on the dusty square. "The bidding," he said, his voice straining for an official tone, "will start at $20 for 1 year of labor." A profound, suffocating silence fell over Drywell. This was not business. This was a spectacle. The men shuffled their boots, and the women on the mercantile porch fanned themselves with a little more vigor, their eyes bright with a terrible curiosity. Reverend Pike nodded, as if a great moral principle were being upheld. Ellie Hart sat on her mare, the reins loose in her gloved hand. She felt the iron key in her pocket, a cold weight of responsibility. This was what it came to. A man's life, his body, sold for the price of a decent horse. And she knew, with a certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone, that Jonah Nez had not stolen any horse. This was Crowell's long, slow squeeze, a public demonstration of his power. He was showing the territory what happened to those who were in his way, or those who were simply inconvenient. Jonah was a message. $20, the sheriff repeated, his eyes scanning the crowd, begging for someone to break the tension. "He ain't worth 10, a man mumbled from the back, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Ray Hutt, still leaning against the post, permitted himself a small, thin smile. Crowell watched, impassive, a king observing his court. Ellie's heart was a dry drum in her chest. She saw the broken fence at her ranch. She saw the bill she owed at the mercantile, the bill that Crowell himself held. She saw the long, empty winter ahead, with no money for seed, no money for feed, no money for anything but this. $20, going once, the sheriff said, his voice cracking. Jonah Nez stood perfectly still. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at his captors. His gaze was fixed on the far mesas, as if he could will himself there through the sheer force of his spirit. He was someplace else, someplace they could not chain. Ellie's, her decision was not a thought. It was a physical thing, a lurch in her gut, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. It was the same instinct that made her run toward a spooked horse, not away from it. She slid from the saddle. Her boots hit the dust with a soft thud that sounded, in the silence, like a gunshot. The crowd turned, every eye fixed on her as she walked forward. her worn skirts dragging in the dirt. She did not stop until she was standing directly in front of the sheriff, close enough to smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "Stop!" she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the heat. Sheriff McCaffrey blinked. He looked like a man woken from a bad dream. "Mrs. Hart, this is official business. Step aside." "You said compensation," Ellie stated. It was not a question. The sheriff's face began to turn a dull red. "It is compensation for Mr. Crowell's loss." "What is the compensation?" she demanded. From the porch, Silas Crowell's voice boomed, smooth and confident. "The horse was a fine stallion, Mrs. Hart, worth $100, but I am a reasonable man. The court set the value at $50. His year of labor," he gestured to Jonah, "would more than cover it." "I will pay the $50, Ellie said. "Now." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Someone laughed, a short, barking sound that was quickly stifled. The women on the porch stopped fanning. Reverend Pike's mouth fell open, a small, dark O of indignation. Jonah's head turned, his eyes, dark and penetrating, locked onto her for the first time. He was no longer on the mesas. He was here, and he was watching her with a fierce, burning intensity that made her skin prickle. Sheriff McCaffrey looked utterly lost. He fumbled with his hat. "Mrs. Hart, this is irregular. We are auctioning his labor." "Is it illegal?" "Sheriff," Ellie challenged him, her voice gaining strength. "You are holding him for a debt. The court set the debt at $50. I am offering to pay that debt, in full. The laws of this territory are quite clear. A debt paid is a debt settled. You cannot legally hold a man, or sell his labor, for a debt that no longer exists." She had him. He knew it, and she knew it. This was paper law, the kind of law that men like Crowell usually twisted to their own purpose. But it was law nonetheless. The sheriff looked frantically toward the mercantile porch, pleading for help. Crowell stepped forward, his heavy boot heels thudding on the boardwalk. His face was no longer pleasant. It was dark, a storm cloud rolling in. "She is addled, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low growl. "The woman does not have $50 to her name. She is trying to make a fool of you." Ellie turned to face him. She stood small in the street, a slight figure against his looming shadow. But she did not back down. "I have it," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "It was the money for my seed. It was the money for my winter feed. But I have it." She turned her back on him, a calculated, shocking insult. She walked past the sheriff, through the stunned crowd, and up the steps to the mercantile. She did not go to Crowell. She went to the pale-faced clerk cowering behind the counter. "Mr. Evans," she said, "you will please give me the $50 from my account." The clerk froze, his eyes darting to Crowell. "Now, Mr. Evans," Ellie said. The clerk, sweating, fumbled with the cash box. He counted out the worn bills, his hands shaking. Ellie took the money, walked back down the steps, and returned to the sheriff. She held the money out to him. "Here is $50. Sheriff, count it, then release him." The reaction was immediate. A man spat in the dust near her feet. "Wasting good money on a savage," he muttered. "Mrs. Prudence Patterson, the banker's wife, whispered to her friend. "She has lost her mind. Utterly lost. That ranch will be Crowell's by Christmas." But young Tommy Blake, the son of Dr. Blake, stood near the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed. He watched Ellie Hart, and a slow, quiet look of profound admiration dawned on his face. He saw exactly what she was doing. Sheriff McCaffrey took the money as if it were burning hot. He counted it slowly, twice, stalling for time. Finally, he could stall no more. He stuffed the bills into his pocket. He turned to Ray Hutt. "Hutt, give her the key for the shackles." Hutt did not move. He looked at Crowell. "Mr. Crowell." Silas Crowell's eyes were chips of black ice. He stared at Ellie, a long, cold stare that promised retribution. "I will have that ranch, Mrs. Hart," he vowed, his voice soft but carrying, "one way or another. This folly changes nothing. You have bought yourself a day of feeling righteous, and you have bought him a walk to the gallows. Nothing more." He gave a tiny, vicious nod. "Give her the key." Ray Hutt unhooked a heavy iron key from his belt. He did not hand it to her. He threw it. It landed in the dust, just shy of her boots. Ellie stared at the key. The entire town stared at it. To bend and pick it up would be the final act of her humiliation. She did not flinch. She bent slowly, with all the dignity of a queen, and picked up the key. She walked to Jonah Nez. He stood as tall as a pine, his face a mask of stone. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the coiled tension of a man who had lived his entire life waiting for the next blow. She stood before him, the key in her hand. The iron cuffs on his wrists were thick, heavy, and stained with rust. She lifted the key. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them steady. She inserted the key into the first lock. The metal was hot from the sun. It took a moment, but the lock clicked open. She pulled the heavy iron hasp apart. She moved to the other wrist. Click! She pulled the open shackles away from his skin. The heavy iron fell from her hands, hitting the dust with a sharp, clinking clang. The sound was finite, a period at the end of a sentence. It was the sound of a small, sharp thing breaking a large, dull one. Jonah did not move for a second. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and rubbed his wrists. The skin underneath was raw, red, and bleeding. He lowered his hands and looked at her. His throat worked. His voice, when it came, was a low rasp, dry from thirst and disuse. "Thank you," he said. It was all he said, but his eyes, they were not just grateful, they were still hunting. Immediately, they flicked past her, to the alley between the saloon and the smithy, to the roofline of the mercantile, to a man who had just ducked back from a window. He was still a prisoner. He was still being watched. Ellie saw it plain as day. This was not over. She turned to the crowd, to the ring of silent, staring faces. She was shaking now, with anger, with fear, with a sudden, terrible clarity. Her voice, when she spoke, was louder than she intended. "He is not an animal." She looked directly at Reverend Pike. He had the decency to look away, his face pale. She looked at her neighbors, the Olsons, the Garretts, the Pattersons. They shuffled. They coughed. They looked at their boots. She turned back to Jonah. Her business with the town was done. Her business with him was just beginning. "Can you ride?" she asked, her voice low again, meant only for him. He gave a single sharp nod. "My mare is over there," she said, gesturing. "We will have to ride double until we are clear of town, or you can walk beside." "I will walk," he said. She nodded. It was the right answer. She went to her mare, took the reins, and began to walk. She did not look back at Crowell, or the sheriff, or the money she had lost. She just walked. Jonah Nez, free of his irons, fell into step half a pace behind her. He was a silent, scarred shadow, a man she had just bought for $50. He was a man who, she suspected, was far more dangerous than anyone in this town, including Crowell, yet understood. And he was now her responsibility. The walk back to the ranch would be long, and the cost of this day was only just beginning to be counted. The road out of Drywell was a trail of silent judgment. Ellie Hart walked, leading her mare, acutely aware of the weight of the town's gaze on her back. She did not look behind her, not even when she heard a horse whicker from the livery, a sound of normal life that felt alien. She kept her eyes on the heat-shimmering line of the horizon, the only thing that seemed to understand her isolation. Jonah Nez walked behind her. He moved with a rhythm that was both weary and predator agile. He was not a prisoner, but he was not free. He was a $50 debt that she had just paid with the last of her future. He was a shadow, and he was, for now, her shadow. They cleared the last of the town's rickety outbuildings, the tanner's smelly yard, and the smithy's pile of rusted metal. The silence of the open territory enveloped them, vast and indifferent. The only sounds were the plodding hooves of the mare, the scuff of Ellie's boots, and the near-silent tread of Jonah's moccasins. He had not spoken another word. He just walked, his gaze constantly moving, scanning the flat, scrub-dotted land, the low mesas in the distance, the wash of the sky. He was reading the world around them, a world that Ellie had only ever seen as an adversary. They had been walking for nearly an hour, the sun a white-hot coin in the sky. The tension that had held Ellie rigid in town was beginning to dissolve into a familiar, bone-deep weariness. She was tired, and she had just done a foolish, ruinous thing. Suddenly, Jonah stopped. His stillness was so abrupt that she walked 2 more paces before realizing. She stopped the mare and turned. He was not looking at her. He was kneeling, his head cocked, listening. He put a hand out, a gesture for her to be silent. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer. His eyes were on the trail. Not their own tracks, but a place just off to the side, partly obscured by a cluster of brittle bush. He rose slowly and moved toward it, his body low. He studied the ground, then stood and walked back to her. "We are followed," he said. His voice was still a rasp. Ellie's blood went cold. She looked back the way they had come. The trail was empty, shimmering in the heat. "I do not see anyone." "2 riders," he said. "They are not trying to be quiet. They are trying to be clever." He led her to the spot he had been looking at. He pointed. In the loose sand, there was a horseshoe print. "I see it," she said, "but it is backward." Jonah said. "The shoe was nailed on reversed. They want anyone who finds their trail to think they are riding the other way. Back to town." Ellie stared at the print. A cold trick, a hunter's trick. "Crowl," she breathed. His words came back to her. "I will have that ranch, one way or another." He had not waited a day. He had not even waited an hour. "They are behind us?" she asked. "No," Jonas said, his eyes scanning the low ridge to their left. "They are ahead. They use this old trail, and they are waiting for us. In the pass." The pass, a narrow cut in the rocks, the only way through the small mesa that separated this valley from her ranch. It was a natural bottleneck, a trap. "We must go back," Ellie said, her heart hammering. "They will see us," Jonah said, "and they will ride us down. We are 1 mare, and they are 2 men on fresh horses." He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see straight through her fear. "We must go forward, but not on the trail." He took the mare's reins from her hand. He did not lead the horse onto the rocks, but into a dry wash that ran parallel to the trail, its sandy bottom offering soft footing and low cover. "Stay low," he commanded, "and quiet." They moved for another 20 minutes, the tension a physical thing, a wire pulled taut between them. The wash was deeper here, the air hotter. Still, Ellie could feel her own pulse in her throat. They came to the mouth of the rocky pass. The wash curved away, leaving them exposed. The main trail, visible just 20 yards away, looked empty. Jonah stopped the horse. He handed the reins back to Ellie. "Wait here," he whispered. "What are you—" He was gone, melting into the rocks like smoke. He did not make a sound. Ellie stood with the mare, her skin prickling, feeling desperately, terribly alone. The horse shifted, blowing nervously through its nostrils. Then, a sound, the sharp crack of a rifle, echoing, doubling back on itself from the canyon walls. Ellie cried out. A second shot followed, the bullet whining, a wicked, metallic sound. As it glanced off a boulder just above her head, the mare screamed, reared, and pulled the reins from Ellie's grasp. No! Ellie lunged for the horse, but it was too late. The mare bolted, terrified, galloping back the way they had come, back toward the open plain. "Get down." Jonah's voice was a low growl. Right beside her, he appeared from nowhere, grabbing her by the waist and pulling her bodily off her feet. She fell hard against the rocky ground, his body covering hers, a shield against the unseen rifles. Dust filled her mouth. "They have seen us," she gasped, struggling. "Stay still," he ordered. He was not looking at her. He was looking up, at the ridge. He pointed. "There." Ellie saw them. Two men, silhouettes against the bright sky, hunkered down behind a line of rocks. They were reloading. "We have to move," he said, pulling her up. "Now!" He did not run back. He ran forward, into the pass, pulling her toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. A dark split in the rock she had never noticed before. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet. They scrambled, half falling, into the opening. They were in a narrow, dark space, a goat track. They were safe for the moment. The gunfire stopped. Ellie sagged against the rock, her breath coming in sobs. They killed the horse." "The horse is fine," Jonah said, his voice flat. "They were shooting at you. They wanted the horse to run. It separates us." They heard the sound of boots on rock, of men scrambling down from the ridge. "Where did they go?" a voice shouted, rough and angry. "Find them!" a second voice yelled. "Mister, Crowell wants him silenced, for good, and the woman too, if she is with him." Ellie froze, silenced. "Why so permanent?" the first voice asked, whining. "It is just one man." "The Navajo saw Hut," the second voice grumbled. Closer now. "He saw Hut with the kerosene down at the Garrett place. Right before the barn fire they blamed on the Dane. Crowell will not have that witness. Now find them." Ellie's mind reeled. The Garrett fire. It had been blamed on a Dine raiding party, had set the whole territory on edge. It was Hut, and Jonah had seen him. The theft charge, the auction, it was all a lie. A scheme to get Jonah and bury him, one way or another. And she had just walked right into the middle of it. Jonah put a finger to his lips. He was listening, his head tilted. The men were moving past their hiding spot, heading down to the main trail, expecting them to have run back. Jonah pointed up. "Up," Ellie whispered, horrified. The rock face was sheer. He did not argue. He began to climb, finding handholds and footholds that were invisible to her. He moved like a spider, with a strength she could not believe. He reached a ledge 10 feet up and looked down. "Come," he said. He reached down a hand. She took it. His grip was iron. He hauled her up, his muscles straining, and pulled her onto the ledge beside him. They were out of the fissure, exposed, but high above the trail. He did not rest. He began moving sideways, along the narrow ledge, taking them up and over the ridge, away from the pass. Ellie followed, her fingers raw, her skirts catching on the rock. She did not look down. She just looked at his back, a solid, moving shadow in the heat. It took them another hour to circle the pass and find the trail again. As Jonah had predicted, the mare was waiting, grazing nervously on a patch of dry grass, half a mile away. The rest of the ride to the ranch was silent. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, when they finally saw the silhouette of her broken-down fence. Ellie slid from the mare, her legs shaking so badly she almost fell. The ranch had never looked so frail, so vulnerable. Jonah took the reins and led the horse to the trough. He ran a hand along its neck, calming it. He looked at the barn, then at the house. He was assessing the territory, the lines of defense. "You can stay in the barn," Ellie said, her voice hoarse. It was all she could offer. "It is dry. There is hay." He gave a single nod. She went into the house. Her hands were trembling. She came back out with 2 items, a small tin of her own herbal salve, and a hunk of dry bread. She held them out. He looked at the tin, then at her. "For your wrists," she said, nodding at the raw, red marks the shackles had left. He took the salve, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, like static. He took the bread. "Thank you," he said. As he turned toward the barn, she spoke again. "Wait." She went back inside. When she returned, she was carrying Jacob's old double-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. She did not hand them to him. She walked to her own porch, just inside the open doorway, and leaned the shotgun against the wall. It was visible from the yard. It was a statement. "I will defend my property," she said, her voice steady. He met her gaze. He understood. It was not a threat. It was a declaration of self-defense, a boundary. He nodded again. The next morning, Ellie awoke to a sound that had been absent for 6 long months. A rhythmic, metallic clank. Squeak, clank, squeak. She ran from the house, her hair unbound. Jonah was at the well. He had taken the pump mechanism apart. The rusted pieces were laid out on an old sack. He had used a piece of leather from a broken bridle to fashion a new gasket, and he was using her salve, not on his wrists, but on the frozen, rusted joints of the pump. He had just finished reassembling it. He put his full weight onto the handle. A hollow, sucking sound. He pumped again. A groan. A third time. A wet gurgle. A cough. He pumped again. A stream of thick, muddy water gushed from the spout. Ellie gasped. He kept pumping, a steady, powerful rhythm. The water turned from mud to a cloudy yellow. And then it ran clear. A thin, beautiful, steady stream of clear, cold water splashed onto the dry stones. Ellie ran forward. She put her hands under the stream, laughing, a sound that felt rusty in her own throat. It was cold. It was real. I thought it was dry forever," she whispered, looking at him. Jonah stopped pumping and looked at the water, then at the thirsty land. "Water always remembers," he said, his voice quiet. "It remembers where it is supposed to go." He watched her for a moment, then turned and walked to the barn. He returned a moment later. He stopped in front of her and held out his hand. In his palm was a small, worn leather pouch. It was heavy. "What is this?" she asked. "For the ranch," he said. She stared. It was silver, coins. "I do not understand." "You paid $50, he said. "This is what I have. It is not 50, but it is for the ranch." Ellie was stunned into silence. This was his, whatever he had in the world. It was in this small bag. "This is yours," she said, her voice thick. "I cannot take this." "It was for passage," he said, his gaze unwavering. "To go north. Now it is for the ranch." She looked at the silver, then at his proud, scarred face. He was not offering her charity. He was offering her a partnership. To refuse it would be to cast him as a slave, the very thing she had tried to prevent. To accept it was to bind herself to him, to this fight, in a way that terrified her. Slowly, she reached out and closed her hand over the warm leather pouch. She did not say thank you. She met his eyes. "For the ranch." She agreed. Word of her action and his presence spread faster than the water from the well. The next Sunday, Reverend Pike delivered a sermon of fire. He did not use Ellie's name, but he did not need to. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, of a woman left to her own devices falling to temptation, of consorting with the heathen, and of the darkness that comes when we invite the savage into our homes. Some in the town nodded, their fear given a righteous voice, but others, Ellie heard, had looked away. The ranch was quiet. The two of them worked from sunup to sundown. They did not talk much, but the silence was different. It was a shared silence, a silence of labor. One evening, Ellie sat on the porch, mending a bridle. Jonah was sitting on the steps, studying a page from an old, discarded newspaper he had found lining a crate. His lips were moving. "You can read?" Ellie asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. He looked up, his face guarded. "The school," he said, and the way he said the word, it sounded like a curse. "They taught me their words, but I am slow." Ellie looked at him, at the man who could read a backward horseshoe print, who could disappear into rocks, who could bring water from a dead well, and who was now struggling with the letters on a page. An idea formed, a sudden, clear path. "We can make a trade," she said. He watched her, wary. "I have no more money." "Not money," she said, setting the bridle aside. "A real trade. Your work is worth wages, but I have no coin to pay you. So we will trade." He waited. "I will teach you to read," she said. "I will teach you all the words. I will teach you the numbers, and the contracts, and the paper laws that men like Crowell use to steal land. I will teach you their words, so you can fight them in their own way." He was silent for a long time, considering her. "And me?" he finally asked. She stood up and looked out at the darkening land, at the ranch that was her whole world. "You will teach me what you know," she said. "You will teach me how to see, how to read those tracks in the dust, how to know when men are coming before they are in the pass. And," she turned to him, "you will teach me about the horses. You understand them in a way I do not." He looked at her, this small, fierce woman who had bought him, who had hidden behind him, and who was now offering him an exchange of equals. He gave a single, slow nod. "I will teach you," he said. The bargain was struck. The next day, the rhythm of the Hart Ranch changed. It was no longer the rhythm of one person's lonely survival. It was the rhythm of two. It began with the fence. The posts Jacob had set were solid, but the rails were split and sagging. Ellie had always done her best, patching with wire and hope. Jonah worked differently. He did not patch. He rebuilt. He found the solid, fallen cottonwood branches by the dry creek bed, and with her axe, he hewed them flat. He did not use nails she did not have. He used hide strips and taught her how to notch the wood, seating rail into post until it was stronger than it had ever been. They worked in silence, the thud of the axe and the rasp of the saw setting a beat. The labor was a thing that healed. With every post he set straight, Ellie felt a piece of her own inner, crumbling structure right itself. The fence line became a declaration. This line will hold. From the fence, they moved to the barn. The roof, which had leaked for 2 winters, was a sieve. Jonah went up on the sun-baked shingles, moving with an easy, cat-like grace. He found the broken spots, and with shingles Ellie had saved, he began to repair the damage. She, on the ground, passed them up to him, one by one. Her arms ached, but the steady, hammering sound from above was the sound of a future, with the well now giving its steady, precious gift. Ellie turned her attention to the square of earth behind the house that had been her garden. It was a graveyard of withered stalks. But the water, guided by small trenches they dug, was a resurrection. The soil, dark and rich, drank greedily. 3 days after the auction, as they were working, a wagon rattled up the trail. Ellie's hand went to the porch, near where the shotgun always leaned. Jonah simply straightened from the fence post he was setting, his body becoming still. It was the Olsons, Lars and his wife, Greta. They were Swedes, homesteaders from the next valley over, people of few words and vast, calloused hands. Lars halted the wagon, a massive, blonde-bearded man. Greta, just as solid, sat beside him. "Mrs. Hart," Lars Olson said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Jonah, his eyes wary but not hostile. He nodded. "Sir." "And Mr. Olson, Mrs. Olson," Ellie said, wiping her hands on her skirt, her heart beating a little too fast. Greta Olson climbed down from the wagon, a sack in her arms. It was flour. She set it on the porch. Lars followed with a small sack of salt and another of dried beans. "The Reverend Pike, he says things," Greta said, her accent thick. She did not look at Ellie. She was busy brushing dust from the flour sack. "He says much, but my Lars, he says a good fence is a good fence, and a good neighbor." She shrugged. A massive, eloquent gesture. "We bring seed. For the garden is late, but with water, maybe." Ellie's throat was tight. She could not speak. Lars Olson cleared his throat, his eyes on the new fence line. "That is good wood," he said, pointing at Jonah's work. "Good joinery." Jonah, who had not moved, gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. Lars nodded back, as if a long conversation had just been concluded. He climbed back onto his wagon. "You need help with horses, you send word," he said, and with a cluck to his team, they were gone, rattling back down the trail in a small, brave cloud of dust. Ellie stood by the sacks of flour and salt, her hand resting on the rough weave. It was the first act of kindness she had known in months, a small, solid thing in a world of dust and wind. The kindness, however, only highlighted the malice. The next afternoon, Mrs. Prudence Patterson rode by on her fine bay mare. She did not stop. She rode close to the fence line, as if inspecting it, her back a rigid rod of judgment. She saw Ellie by the well, and she saw Jonah mending a bridle in the shade of the barn. Mrs. Patterson's face, tight with disapproval, was a clear echo of Reverend Pike's sermon. She looked at Ellie, then at Jonah, and she sniffed, a sound audible even from 20 yards away. Then she snapped her reins and rode on, carrying the news of their shared labor back to the righteous gossips of Dry Well. The community had drawn its line. The Olsons were on one side, Mrs. Patterson, and the power she represented was on the other. Crowell's answer to her defiance did not come by rider. It came in the dark. Ellie found it when she went to unlatch her door in the gray light of dawn. On the stone step, its small body stiff, was a dead rat. Tucked under its paw was a folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words were crudely formed, spelled out in charcoal. "Sell out before it is too late." She dropped it as if it were on fire. A cold, sick fear washed over her. This was not a legal notice. This was not a bank. This was a different kind of law. The law of the shadow, the law of the knife in the dark. Jonah came around the side of the house, his arms full of firewood. He saw her face. Then he saw the rat on the step. He set the wood down. He did not look angry. He looked tired, as if this were an old, familiar story. He nudged the rat with the toe of his moccasin. He picked up the piece of paper, his lips moving as he slowly sounded out the words. He crumpled it in his fist. "Hut," he said. It was not a question. I think so," Ellie stammered. Jonah looked out at the mesas, his face hard and closed. He said nothing. He picked up the rat by its tail, walked 100 yards from the house, and threw it into the brush. He came back, picked up the firewood, and went to the stove. The incident was not mentioned again. But that night, the world felt different. The darkness was no longer a comfort, a rest from the sun. It was a threat. Ellie lay in her small bed, the iron key to the house on the table beside her. She could not sleep. The wind was rising, scraping a loose branch against the side of the house. It sounded like fingers, scratching. Then another sound, a horse, whickering. But it was not her mare. It was distant. It sounded like a rider, moving slowly, just beyond the new fence line. She sat bolt upright, her heart in her throat. The rat, too late. She slid from the bed, her feet cold on the wooden floor. She went to the window, peering out into the moon-drenched yard. The barn was a dark shape. The yard was empty, But the sound was real. A horse circling, probing, testing their defenses. Then she saw him. Jonah was not in the barn. He was sitting on the top step of her porch, his back against the post. He was just a silhouette, utterly still, watching the darkness. On the wooden step beside him, glinting in the faint moonlight, was Jacob's old Colt revolver. She had given it to him. After the attack in the pass, she had found it in Jacob's trunk, still oiled, a box of shells beside it. She had offered it. "You taught me to read tracks." She'd said, "This is another kind of paper law." He had taken it, his face unreadable. He had spent an hour cleaning it, checking the action, his hands moving with a practiced, terrible competence. Now he sat with it, a silent guardian, and Ellie knew, with a sudden, profound certainty, that this was not the first night he had sat there. He had not slept in the barn. He had been sleeping on her porch, a one-man army, every night since they had returned. She went back to bed, but the fear was gone. It was replaced by something else, something heavier and warmer. She was not alone in this fight. The shared danger. The night spent with an armed guard on her porch. It unwound something inside her. The next evening, after their meal of beans and the bread made from Olson's flour, they sat on the porch. The heat was leaching from the air, leaving a cool, purple twilight. "He died of a fever," Ellie said, her voice quiet. Jonah stopped his work. He was braiding a new rope. "The colt," he said, understanding. "My husband, Jacob." She had not spoken his name to a stranger in a year. It was not a noble death. It was not a bullet or a horse. She pulled her shawl tighter. It was just a fever. It came on him in the summer. He burned for 3 days. His skin was like fire. Dr. Blake came, but there was nothing to do. He just burned away. And I sat there. I held his hand. I wiped his face, and I could do nothing. She was quiet, her own memory a cold stone. "I look at this land, and all I see is the thing that killed him. The heat, the dust." Jonah watched her, his dark eyes full of the falling night. He set the rope aside. When he spoke, his voice was low, and he looked at the mountains, not at her. "My village was in a canyon," he said. "It was a good place. Water from the rocks, corn. My sister, she was small. She liked to chase the goats." He paused, the memory taking him. "The soldiers came in the winter. We did not know. They came with fire. They burned the hogans. They burned the corn. They shot the sheep. It was—" He stopped. It was not a fever. It was a fire, a real fire. He closed his eyes for a second. "I was young, but I was big. I fought. I ran, carrying my mother. When the smoke cleared, when we came back, my sister, she was gone. We never found her, not in the snow, not in the ashes, just gone." He looked down at his hands, scarred and hard. "The school, they took me after that. They gave me this name, Jonah, a man swallowed by a great fish." He gave a small, bitter laugh. They were right. Ellie looked at him, his proud, broken profile against the last light. She saw the scar on his cheek, the one on his neck. War, school, fire, loss. Her grief for Jacob, her small, private, fever grief, felt suddenly like a single, thin note in a vast, terrible chorus. She did not feel diminished. She felt seen. She reached out, a small, impulsive gesture, and laid her hand on his arm. Just for a second. His skin was warm. His muscle was like stone. "I am sorry," she whispered. He looked at her hand, then at her face. He nodded. "I am sorry," he said, for her. They sat in that shared, wounded silence for a long time. The barrier was down. The next day, she went to her desk. The rat, the note, sell out. She pulled out the tin box where Jacob kept his papers. She would not be scared off. She would fight. She would use their own paper laws. She spread the documents on the kitchen table. The deed, the bill of sale for the horses, the loan from the bank in Prescott. She smoothed them out. Jonah came in, and she looked up. "Our lesson," she said. "This is the paper law." She showed him the deed, the lines that marked her land. She showed him the banknote, and then she saw it. It was not a loan from the bank in Prescott. Not anymore. It had been sold. The signature on the bottom of the transfer document was meticulous, arrogant, and as familiar to her as a snake. Silas Crowell. He owned her. He had bought her note. She frantically scanned the page, her rusty reading skills slowing her down. There, at the bottom, the due date, the final payment. 30 days, she whispered, her blood turning to ice. It is due, the whole thing, in 30 days. Crowell had not just been patient. He had been planning. The theft charge, the auction, it was all a game. The real trap was this piece of paper. He had her. Jonah stood beside her, looking at the paper she was staring at. He pointed to the signature. Crowell, he said. He could read that name. He looked at the date. He could read the numbers. 30 days. He looked at her, his face grim. He will not wait 30 days, he said. Ellie looked outside, her gaze sweeping over the ranch, the fence, the barn, the well, all the work they had done. It was for nothing. Jonah put his hand on the table, next to the paper. His fingers splayed. No, he said, his voice a low, hard thing. We work. The evenings changed. The lessons became more urgent. She taught him the words on the mortgage note. Default, foreclosure, title. He learned them. He carved them into his memory. He taught her how to read the wind, how to tell a man's mood by the way his horse stood. He brought her to the small band of horses, and he hummed that low, strange song. The horses, usually skittish, grew calm. They leaned into him. What is that? She asked. Her voice hushed. It is a song for them. He said, it tells them they are safe. It tells them their hooves are strong and the grass is sweet. They sat on the porch, too tired to move. The work of the day settling into their bones. They were close, not touching, but aware. A shoulder brushing a shoulder as she reached for a cup of water. His hand near hers as he pointed to a letter in the book. A new, fragile thing was growing in the dust, in the shadow of Crowell's threat. It had no name. One afternoon, Jonah was teaching her how to read the clouds, how to tell if they held water or just wind. He stopped, his head lifting. He sniffed the air. Ellie smelled it too, faint, acrid. He pointed to the horizon, far to the east, over the ridge that marked the Garrett's property line. A thin, dark tendril of smoke was rising, lazy and dark against the pale, unforgiving sky. It was not the smoke of a cook fire. It was too thick. It was not the smoke of a chimney. It was the wrong color. Trouble, Jonah said, his voice flat. The land is getting ready to burn. The smell of smoke, at first a mere question in the air, became an answer in less than a minute. The wind shifted, and the acrid tang of burning grass, of hot, dry terror, filled their lungs. Jonah looked at the plume. It was no longer thin. It was a thick, churning column of gray and black, rising from the direction of the Garrett ranch. The wind is from the west, he said, his voice flat. It is running with the wind. It will be fast. There was no discussion. There was no plan. There was only action. Ellie ran for the barn, grabbing the worn bridle for her mare. Jonah was a step ahead of her, taking the rope for the faster of her 2 remaining ranch horses, a rangy gelding with a wiry strength. They did not bother with saddles. The water sacks, Ellie yelled, her voice high with the adrenaline. Jonah grabbed 2 empty burlap sacks from the barn, shoving them at her. He ran to the well, worked the pump handle with fast, powerful strokes, and soaked 2 more. He slung the wet, heavy bags over the gelding's back as Ellie scrambled onto her mare. In less than 2 minutes, they were riding low over the horses' necks, racing the plume of smoke that was already spreading like a stain across the sky. The ride was a frantic, breathless prayer. The smell grew stronger. Choking, ash began to fall, gray flakes of consumed earth dusting their shoulders. When they topped the low ridge that separated their properties, the sight that met them was an inferno. Jim Garrett's fields were gone, a sea of black, rippling char. The fire, driven by the hot, relentless wind, had leaped the creek bed and was now climbing the small hill toward his house and barn. The barn, built of old, dry timber, was already catching. Flames licked at the corner of the structure, and smoke poured from the eaves. A small, desperate group of neighbors, including the Olsons, had formed a bucket brigade from the Garrett's well, but it was a child's effort against a giant. They were throwing cups of water at a roaring furnace. The heat was a physical blow, pushing them back. Jim Garrett himself was screaming, his voice raw. "The horses, get the horses!" He ran toward the barn, but a wall of flame shot up from a hay bale, driving him back, his shirt smoking. Then a sound that cut through the roar of the fire, a high, thin scream. It was not an animal, it was a woman. Mrs. Garrett, her face a mask of soot and terror, burst from the small cabin, her hands clawing at her hair. "Emma!" she shrieked. "My baby, she is not in the house, Emma. She was playing in the barn. She likes to hide in the hay." The blood in Ellie's veins turned to ice. She stared at the barn, which was no longer just a building. It was a tomb. Smoke, thick and black, was billowing from the open hayloft. Jim Garrett heard his wife. His face collapsed. "No," he whimpered. "No, no, no." He made another desperate lunge for the door. Emma, Lars Olsen, his big face grim, tackled him, pulling him back. "It's too late, man," he yelled. "You go in there. You do not come out." Ellie slid from her mare, her legs trembling. She did not know what she was doing. She just knew she had to do something. She looked for Jonah. He was already off his horse. He was not looking at the panicked crowd. He was looking at the barn, his eyes narrow, calculating. He was reading the fire as he had read the backward horseshoe prints. He saw how the wind was feeding it, where the hottest parts were, and where the structure was weakest. He ripped one of the wet burlap sacks from his horse, the one he had brought to fight the fire. He ran to the water trough, where the last of the water sizzled with falling embers. He plunged the sack in, soaking it again. "Jonah," Ellie said, her voice a small, lost thing. "Jonah, what?" He did not answer her. He looked at Mrs. Garrett, who was on her knees, sobbing. He looked at Jim Garrett, a broken man, held fast by Olsen. He wrapped the wet, heavy sack around his head and shoulders, leaving only a slit for his eyes. He grabbed another piece of wet canvas, holding it over his left arm, and then he ran. He ran straight at the wall of fire and smoke and disappeared inside the barn. "No!" Ellie screamed, her voice joining the chorus of horror from the crowd. "The savage is mad!" a man shouted. "He has run to his death!" Mrs. Garrett stopped sobbing. She stared at the doorway he had vanished into, her eyes wide with a desperate, impossible hope. Inside, the world was a roaring, suffocating hell. The heat was like a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. Smoke was so thick he could not see his own hand. The crackle of burning hay and the groan of shifting timbers was deafening. He crouched low, where the air was clearer. He could feel the fire on his skin, even through the wet sack. He listened. He closed his eyes for a second, filtering out the roar. He listened for the one sound that did not belong. A whimper, a cough. There, to his left, under the hayloft, in the small, enclosed feed room. He moved, not by sight, but by memory of the layout. by the feel of the heat. He shoved a pile of burning tack aside, his protected arm taking the brunt of the heat. He kicked open the feed room door. She was huddled in a large, empty grain bin, her small face streaked with tears and soot, her eyes wide and white in the gloom. She was not crying. She was too terrified to make a sound. He did not speak. He tore the sack from his own head and wrapped it around her, cocooning her small body, leaving only a small opening for her to breathe. He lifted her. She weighed nothing. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice a low growl. As he turned, a sound like a freight train filled the barn. The main loft beam, eaten through by the fire, groaned. He did not hesitate. He did not look up. He ran, shielding the child with his body, his left arm raised to protect his head. The beam crashed down, exactly where he had been standing. A shower of sparks and flaming timber rained down on them. He felt a searing, unimaginable pain as a piece of burning wood struck his raised arm, the canvas sizzling, the flesh underneath blistering instantly. He did not stop. He ran through the wall of sparks, through the doorway, and back into the breathable air. He burst out of the smoke, a tall, dark figure, something unearthly, covered in soot and ash, a small bundle clutched to his chest. He took 3 steps into the yard and fell to one knee, the child held aloft. The crowd, which had been standing in stunned silence, gasped. He unwrapped the sack. Little Emma Garrett, coughing, crying, but alive, blinked in the sudden light. Jonah pushed the child into her mother's outstretched arms. "Mrs." Garrett fell on her daughter, her sobs now of gratitude, not grief. Jonah remained on one knee for a moment, his head bowed, dragging air into his own scorched lungs. His left arm was smoking. The canvas was burned away, and the shirt sleeve beneath was blackened, stuck to his skin. A small boy, it was Tommy Blake's younger brother, pointed. His voice was hushed, full of awe. "Mama," he whispered, he is like a smoke angel." The name hung in the air, a strange new thing. Jim Garrett, his face a ruin of conflicting emotions, walked forward. He stopped in front of Jonah, who was slowly, painfully, getting to his feet. Garrett looked at the child in his wife's arms. He looked at the smoking ruin of his barn. He looked at this dying warrior, the man he had been taught to fear, the man his town had sought to chain. He saw the raw, blistering burn on Jonah's arm, a wound taken for his child. Garrett was not a large man, but he was a proud one. He swallowed, his throat working. He stuck out a calloused, dirty hand. "Mr. Nez," he said, his voice cracking. I am sorry. I owe you her life." The entire community was watching. This was more than an apology. It was a retraction. It was a public shift. Jonah looked at the outstretched hand. He looked at the man. His own arm was a fire of pure agony. After a long, silent moment, he raised his right hand, ignoring the pain, and clasped Jim Garrett's in a firm grip. The handshake, seen by all, was like a treaty being signed. The fire was beaten back, the house and cabin saved, though the barn was a total loss. But the true fire, the one of hate and fear, had been dampened. The next Sunday, Reverend Pike climbed his pulpit, his face pale and tight. He had seen the shift. He had heard the whispers of Smoke Angel, and it terrified him. He pounded the lectern. "Beware," he thundered. "Beware the devil when he comes in pleasing form. Even Satan himself can disguise himself as an angel of light." Or, his voice dripped with scorn, "as a smoke angel, to fool the unwary, to lead the flock astray with a single act of seeming goodness." But this time, the words did not land. Ellie, watching from the back, saw Mrs. Garrett, her daughter in her lap, look down and shake her head. She saw Lars Olsen cross his arms and stare at the ceiling. The Reverend's power, built on fear, had been challenged by an act of courage. Sheriff McCaffrey caught Ellie outside the mercantile. He looked tired. Mrs. Hart. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. That was a damn brave thing your man did. He is not my man, Sheriff, Ellie said, her voice quiet but hard. He is Jonah Nez, and he is a free citizen. McCaffrey had the grace to look ashamed. Yes, well, he cleared his throat. The law is still the law. Ellie, Crowell's note. That is a legal document. I have to uphold it. He lowered his voice. And he is not happy. He is pressing the bank. I heard he sent a man to Prescott. They are not going to give you any leeway. That 30-day deadline is a hard one. It was a warning, a small but important gesture. He was telling her he was on the side of the paper, but the paper was all he had. The threat was not idle. A few nights later, they came, 4 riders, their faces masked by shadow, carrying torches. They did not ride close. They circled the ranch house, just outside the fence line, whooping and yelling. "Get that redskin out, widow!" one shouted. "This ain't no place for him!" "Crowell's land," another yelled. "Get off it!" Jonah, his burned arm wrapped in linen bandages Ellie had prepared, moved to the barn. He picked up the Colt, his face a grim mask in the moonlight. But Ellie walked onto the porch. She was carrying Jacob's shotgun. She did not hide. She stood in the pool of light from her own lamp, a clear, unmistakable target. She cranked a shell into the chamber. The shuck-shuck sound was terrifyingly loud in the night air. The riders stopped. They stared at the small woman on the porch, holding the big gun. "This is my land," Ellie called out, and her voice did not tremble. "It is the Hart Ranch. The next man who crosses that fence line is trespassing, and I will shoot him." There was a long silence. The men muttered to each other. One of them, his voice raw, was clearly Ray Hutt. "The widow's got nerve," he spat, "but Crowell will have this land. One way or another, this ain't over." They glared at her for another moment, but the shotgun did not waver. They had come to terrorize a lone woman. They had not counted on this. Cursing, they turned their horses and rode away, their torches a retreating, angry red glow. Ellie stayed on the porch, the heavy gun in her arms, until the last flicker of light was gone. Jonah emerged from the shadow of the barn, the Colt still in his hand. He walked to the porch and stood at the bottom step, looking up at her. He did not say anything. He just looked at her, and his gaze held a new, deep respect. She had held the line. She met his gaze, and she knew they were in this together. The next afternoon, they had a different visitor. Tommy Blake, the doctor's son, rode up on a sturdy pony. He was carrying a book. Mrs. Hart," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Nez." He dismounted, his young face earnest. "I saw what you did at the Garrett place. Mr. Nez, it was the bravest thing I have ever seen." He turned to Jonah. "My father says I should be a doctor, but I do not want to read those books. I want to read this." He pointed to the land, the sky. "I want to understand the horses. The way you do, I heard you sing to them. And I want to learn to track, not to hunt men, but to understand, to know the land." Jonah looked at the young man for a long time. He saw no deceit, only a raw, honest hunger for knowledge. He saw an ally. "It is hard work," Jonah said, his voice low. "I am not afraid of work, sir," Tommy said, his eyes bright. Jonah looked at his own bandaged arm. He needed help. They needed help. "You will come 3 days a week," he said. "After your father's chores. You will bring your own water. You will mend fences, and you will listen. And maybe I will teach you." Tommy beamed. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Sir." He was an ally, a new generation. But the old generation had one last card to play. The next day, the rider from Prescott came. He did not bring good news. He brought an official letter from the bank. It was curt, legal, and final. Crowell had paid them, or threatened them, or both. The bank was accelerating the note. The full amount was due. 30 days. Ellie held the paper. The final, cold confirmation of the sheriff's warning. 30 days. It was a death sentence for the ranch. She looked out at the yard, where Jonah, his arm in a sling, was showing Tommy Blake how to read the small, almost invisible print of a coyote's track. The bet was on. The clock was running. The week after the torch riders, the valley was quiet. It was the heavy, watchful quiet that comes before a storm, or a truce. The news of the 30-day deadline on Ellie's note had spread, carried by Mrs. Patterson and the mercantile clerk. It was a death sentence, and the town held its breath to see if she would fold. But the fire at the Garrett place had burned away more than a barn. It had burned away the community's apathy. Jim Garrett, a man hollowed out by loss and then refilled by a miracle, was not a man to let a debt go unpaid. He put the word out of barn raising, not just for his family, but for the valley. They came on a Saturday, just 10 days after the fire. They came from homesteads Ellie had not even known existed. The Olsons arrived first, their wagon loaded with milled lumber Lars had brought all the way from Prescott. Tommy Blake rode in, leading 3 pack mules from his father's livery. Even a few families who had sided with Reverend Pike came, looking ashamed but determined, bringing pots of beans and dried apple pies. This was the law of the West, the one that superseded all others you helped your neighbor rebuild. To refuse was to admit you were no neighbor at all. Ellie and Jonah rode in on her mare, Jonah riding behind her, his burned arm still in a sling, the colt he now wore openly at his hip. As they approached, a hush fell. Jim Garrett walked out to meet them, his daughter Emma riding on his shoulders.
Mrs. Hart,
he said, his voice rough. He looked up at Jonah.
Mr. Nez, your arm.
It will mend, Jonah said, swinging down from the horse. His movement was stiff, and Ellie saw him wince as his feet hit the ground. We are here to work, Ellie said, sliding down. Garrett nodded, a profound respect in his eyes. And we are glad to have you. The work was hard, a frenzy of organized purpose. The men, their shirts dark with sweat, cleared the charred timbers. The women set up long tables, organizing the food, the water, and the children. The air, which had smelled of ash and defeat, now rang with the sound of hammers, saws, and the shouts of men. They came to the main ridge beam. It was a massive piece of ponderosa pine, heavy and unwieldy. It was the spine of the new barn. Lars Olson and Jim Garrett led the team, 4 men on each side, trying to heave it up onto the 10-foot support posts. They strained, their faces red, but the beam was too heavy, their leverage wrong. It slipped, crashing back to the sawhorses, narrowly missing a man's leg.
Again,
Lars shouted, spitting dust. They set themselves, and again they failed. The energy of the day faltered, the hammering stopped. Jonah, who had been quietly helping Tommy Blake notch smaller supports, walked forward. He stood for a moment, his good hand resting on the massive beam, feeling its weight, its balance.
It is not just weight,
he said, his voice quiet, but it carried in the sudden hush. Lars Olson turned, his face sweaty and frustrated.
Is heavy, Mr. Nez, is all it is.
No, Jonah said. He pointed with his good hand. You are lifting, but you are not lifting together. You, he pointed to a man on the end, are lifting a second before him. You are fighting each other. He walked the length of the beam. And it is not balanced. The heavy end is here, at the knot. You must lift here first. He placed his hand on a spot 3 feet from the end. The men looked at each other. They looked at Garrett.
Do as he says,
Garrett said, his voice flat. He knows things we do not. Jonah placed the men. He put Lars, the strongest, at the heavy end. Now, he said, listen to my voice. I will say lift. You will not move until the word is done. Then you will breathe in and push up as one. He stood back. He watched them set their shoulders. He waited. Lift, he said. 8 men, as one, breathed and heaved. The beam rose 6 inches. Good, Jonah said. Hold, now. The men on the posts. Set the poles. We will lever it. He directed the process, his voice never rising, his commands simple, precise. He was not a boss, he was a conductor. He understood the physics of the thing, the way the wood and the men worked. In 20 minutes of hard, coordinated effort, the massive ridge beam, the spine of the new barn, slid into its notches atop the posts. It was set. A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. The men stood back, looking at the beam, then at Jonah. Lars Olsen, wiping his face on his sleeve, walked over and clapped Jonah on his good shoulder. Is good, he said. Good joinery. Jim Garrett climbed onto a wagon bed, a tin cup of water in his hand. The crowd gathered around. We have a roof, he said, his voice thick. He looked at his wife, who was crying quiet tears of joy. He looked at his daughter. We have a home again, because of all of you. He raised his cup. To our neighbors. The crowd murmured. To neighbors. And, Garrett said, his voice growing stronger. One more. I do not have the words. My wife, my Emma. He turned and found Jonah, who was standing at the edge of the crowd, his face impassive. Garrett raised the cup high. To Jonah Nez, he shouted, his voice cracking. The man who walked into the fire, the man who saved my daughter. The silence was absolute. This was it, the moment of turning. Garrett looked at the faces, daring them. He is a better man than I. He is the best man in this valley. To Jonah Nez. Tommy Blake was the first to cheer. Then Lars Olsen let out a deep-throated yah, and then the whole valley. A ragged, sudden chorus of voices cheered. They raised their cups. They stomped their feet. Mrs. Patterson, standing near the back, looked pale. Reverend Pike, who had not come, would hear of this. The tide had turned. Far off, on the ridge, 2 riders watched the scene through a spyglass. Ray Hutt lowered the glass, a look of bored disgust on his face. They are cheering him, Mr. Crowell, like he is a damned hero. Silas Crowell's face was dark. He did not look at the celebration. He looked at the land. He watched the tiny figures of men working together, rebuilding what he had tried to destroy. He had miscalculated. He had thought to isolate Ellie Hart, and he had, instead, given her an army. Let them have their day. Crowell growled. Let them build their little barn. They are celebrating a man. I am holding the paper. The paper, Mr. Hutt, always wins. Hutt nodded, though he was watching the celebration with a more pragmatic eye. He was taking notes, his memory sharp, ticking off the faces he saw. Olsen, Garrett, the Blakes, every homesteader who had just publicly sided with the widow and the Navajo. What are your orders, sir? Hutt asked. We wait, Crowell said, turning his horse. The 30-day note is a rope. They are just enjoying the view before they drop. Back at the barn raising, the work continued, fueled by a new, shared energy. As the sun began to dip, Tommy Blake found Ellie. He was carrying a crate of empty bottles, but his face was electric with excitement. Mrs. Hart, he said, his voice low, pulling her aside. I think I found something. What is it? Tommy. He looked around, then pulled a crumpled, greasy piece of paper from his pocket. I was at the mercantile yesterday, he whispered, helping my father load supplies. I saw this, snagged on a nail by the loading dock. It must have fallen from someone's pocket. Ellie took the paper. It was a receipt from the mercantile. 5 gallons, kerosene, and a date, October 12th. It was the day of the Garrett barn fire. Her hand began to shake. At the bottom, a scrawled signature. It was almost illegible, but the first letter was a R, and the last was a T.
Hut,
She breathed. That is what I thought, Tommy said, his eyes bright. And Mrs. Hart. I help Mr. Evans with the books sometimes. I see the ledger. That is not Ray Hutt's real signature. He signs clear, Raymond J. Hutt. This is a forgery. Like he was signing for someone else, or trying to make it look like someone else. He was, Ellie said, the pieces clicking into place. He was buying the kerosene, but he forged the signature so it could not be traced. But he dropped the receipt. She stared at the paper. It was not just a receipt. It was a weapon. It was the paper law.
Tommy,
She said, her voice full of a sudden, fierce hope. You are a good man. Thank you. She left the celebration, Jonah at her side. She did not go home. She rode straight to Drywell. She did not go to the sheriff. She went to the small, dusty office over the land deeds office, the one with a small, faded sign, H. Finch, attorney at law. Mr. Finch was a small, pale man who looked like he lived on dust and paper. He looked terrified when she walked in, this widow with a notorious dine warrior at her back. Mrs. Hart, he stammered, polishing his spectacles. Ellie did not waste time. She laid the 30-day mortgage note on his desk. She laid the greasy receipt next to it. Mr. Crowell holds this note, she said, pointing to the mortgage. He intends to take my ranch in 22 days. Finch sighed. I am sorry. Mrs. Hart, a legal debt. And this, she said, tapping the receipt, is proof that his man, Ray Hutt, bought 5 gallons of kerosene on the day the Garrett barn burned down and forged a signature to hide it. Finch's eyes widened. He picked up the receipt, his hands trembling. My word, this is an accusation. Mrs. Hart. It is evidence. Mr. Finch, Ellie said, her voice hard as stone. I believe Silas Crowell is engaged in a criminal conspiracy. He is using arson, fraud, and intimidation to devalue the property of this valley so he can seize it. She leaned forward. I want you to file an injunction, a temporary stop on that foreclosure, based on his bad faith, based on his crimes. Finch looked from the paper to her, to Jonah, and back. He was a small man, but he was a man who believed in the law. He saw a case, a real one. This is highly irregular, Mrs. Hart, but it is not impossible. An injunction. Yes, we can petition the circuit judge. No, Ellie said. We do not have time for the circuit judge. He will not be here for 2 months. We will petition the magistrate at the market court. The market court, Finch was appalled. That is a public spectacle. Yes, Ellie said. That is exactly what it is. She left the office, a new, fragile hope in her heart. As she and Jonah rode out of town, the sky, which had been a clear, burning blue, began to cloud over. A cool wind blew from the east, carrying the smell of ozone. By the time they reached the Garrett Ranch, the first fat drops of rain were falling. The barn raising was breaking up, people running for their wagons, laughing. The rain was not a deluge. It was a brief, cleansing shower. It hissed on the hot, dry ground, and it washed the black, stubborn ash from the earth. The air, in seconds, smelled clean. It smelled of wet dirt and pine and new beginnings. Jonah stopped the mare by the new barn frame. He looked up, his face turned to the sky, letting the cool water run down his scarred cheeks. He closed his eyes, a small, almost invisible smile touching his lips. Ellie, watching him, felt her own heart lift. The land was being washed clean. She stood on a wagon bed, the same one Garrett had used. "Friends," she called out, her voice carrying in the rain-washed air. The people stopped, turning to her. "Thank you for today. You have all seen what we can do when we stand together." She held up the small, greasy receipt. "Mr. Crowell thinks he owns us. He thinks his money and his paper gives him the right to burn us out, to steal our homes." A low, angry murmur went through the crowd. "This is a receipt for the kerosene ray hut used to burn the Garrett's barn. I have filed a petition, and I want you all to be my witnesses. At the market court, on the 1st of next month, I will present this evidence to the magistrate. We will see what the law says. We will see if one man's greed is stronger than this whole valley." It was a declaration of war, a challenge, issued in the clean, rain-scented air, in front of the whole community. That night, the ranch was silent. The air was cool. Ellie and Jonah sat on the porch, not talking, just breathing in the new world. There was hope. The hope lasted until dawn. Ellie woke, as she always did, and went to the pump. She moved the handle, a hollow, sucking sound, no water. She frowned. She pumped again. Nothing, just a dry, metallic groan. "Jonah!" she called, a new, cold fear in her voice. He came from the barn, already dressed. He saw her face, then looked at the pump. He took the handle. He worked it, his good arm strong, but the well was dead. He did not speak. He began to walk, his eyes on the ground, following the line of the pipe he had so carefully laid from the well to the trough. He walked past the barn, down the slight hill toward the dry creek bed, where the pipe was hidden in the rocks. Ellie followed him. He stopped. He knelt, his hand on the metal. Then he just bowed his head. Ellie came up beside him. She saw it. The pipe was not broken. It was cut. It had been sawed through, clean, in 2 places. A 6-foot section was missing, stolen in the night. Crowell had given his answer. It was not a legal document. It was a blade. He had not just cut their pipe. He had cut their lifeline. The ranch, the horses, the garden. Without water. They had just days. The 30-day clock had become a 72-hour one. The silence at the cut pipe was absolute. It was the sound of a death sentence. Ellie stared at the clean, sawed edges of the metal, a vicious, metallic grin in the rock. The water from the well was already seeping into the dry sand just yards from the pump, a dark, spreading stain of waste. Their hope, which had run so clear and cold the day before, was bleeding into the ground. The horses. Her first thought was for the horses. They had enough water in the trough for one day, perhaps. But without the pump, the ranch was just a collection of dry wood in a hot, dry valley. They had hours. "He cut it," she whispered, her voice a dry thing in her own throat. He sent a man in the night and cut it." Jonah was not looking at the pipe. He was looking at the ground around it. He was already reading the new story, the one left in the dirt. He knelt, his bandaged arm held carefully at his side. He touched the ground, a light, brushing motion of his fingers. "One man," he said. He pointed. "A heavy man. He wore new boots. The heel is sharp." He stood and his eyes scanned the ground, moving away from the pipe, back toward the main trail. He was on foot. He left his horse back on the ridge, so we would not hear him ride up. He started to walk, his head down, reading the almost invisible story. Ellie followed, her mind numb. The court, the injunction, the receipt. It all seemed like a children's game now. This was the real law, a hacksaw in the night. "He went this way," Jonah said, his voice low and hard. He followed the tracks, which were now just a scuff on the rock, a displaced pebble. He was moving faster now, his long, quiet strides eating up the ground. He was no longer a ranch hand. He was a hunter. "Jonah, wait!" Ellie called, running to catch up. "What are we doing? We have to go to town. We have to tell the sheriff." He stopped and turned to her. His face was a mask she had not seen before. It was the face of the warrior who had been in the schools, in the wars. It was cold, and it was ancient. "The sheriff," he said, and his voice was flat, "will take a report. He will write it on paper. By the time he comes out here, our horses will be dead and we will be gone." He looked back at the trail. "The man who did this, he took the piece of pipe with him. He is not just breaking us. He is mocking us. He is showing us he can take what he wants."
"So what do we do?"
she asked, her voice trembling.
You cannot go after him. Your arm."
"My arm is fine," he lied. "My eyes are better." He looked at her. "He thinks he is a hunter. He is not. He is just a man with a saw." He started walking again. This time, Ellie did not question. She went back to the barn, grabbed her own canteen of water, strapped Jacob's colt onto her hip. The leather felt strange and heavy, and ran after him. She would not be left behind. She would not be the woman waiting. They followed the tracks for an hour, up from the creek bed, into the high, broken country. The sun was climbing, and the heat was already a physical weight. Jonah moved with a relentless, ground-covering pace. He did not seem to tire. He was a piece of the landscape, moving through it. He led her to a high, rocky pass, a different one from where they had been ambushed. This one was narrower, a crack in the mesa wall. And there, in a patch of damp sand where a small spring wept from the rock, was a clear, perfect boot print. "The new boots," Ellie said. "Yes," Jonah said. He knelt. "He stopped here for water. He is not smart. He is thirsty." Jonah stood, and his eyes went up. They were at the base of a wide, flat mesa. "He is up there," he said. "How do you know?" "He did not go back to town," Jonah said. "He went up to watch. He wants to see us find the pipe. He wants to watch us fail." He looked at the boot print again. "Ray Hut." "Hut," Ellie said. "How can you tell?" "The way he walks," Jonah said. "He puts his weight on his left foot. He is heavy, but he tries to be light. This is his print." He looked at Ellie. "Stay here. Get the sheriff." "No," Ellie said, and the word was as hard as his. "I am not leaving you. He has a rifle. Jonah, I saw him shoot in town. He has a rifle, and you have one good arm. You are not going up there alone." He stared at her, a long, hard look. He was seeing the woman who had stood on the porch with the shotgun. He nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. "Then you will do exactly as I say. You will not make a sound, and you will not show yourself." The climb to the top of the mesa was a lung-burning, hand-scraping misery. Jonah led, finding a narrow, winding game trail. He moved like a shadow, his moccasins silent. Ellie's boots were loud, clumsy. She bit her lip, tasting her own blood in the dust, forcing herself to place her feet as he did, to use the rocks for cover. When they reached the top, they were on a flat, wind-swept expanse of rock and short, brittle grass. A few stunted junipers clung to the stone. Jonah pulled her behind a large boulder, his good hand a steel grip on her arm. He pointed. A quarter-mile away, at the far rim of the mesa, a man was sitting. His horse was tethered nearby, grazing. The man had a rifle across his lap and a spyglass to his eye. He was looking down, in the direction of their ranch. It was Hut. He was, as Jonah had said, watching. "Now," Jonah whispered. "We wait." They waited for an eternity. The sun beat down. Ellie's canteen was low, but she did not drink. They watched Hut. He was bored. He lowered the spyglass, took a long pull from a flask, and spat on the ground. He was arrogant. He was safe. Then, his horse lifted its head. It had scented them on the wind. It whickered, a low, nervous sound. Hut stood up, snatching his rifle. "Who is there?" he yelled, his voice thin in the vast open. "He has seen us," Ellie whispered, her hand going to the colt. "No," Jonah said. "He has smelled us.
Now he is blind, but he will be fast.
Jonah stepped out from behind the boulder. He did not crouch. He stood tall, his bandaged arm in plain sight. "Hut!" he called, and his voice was not a shout. It was a command, and it rolled across the mesa. Ray Hut spun around. When he saw Jonah, his face was a mask of pure shock. Then rage. "You!" he screamed. He raised his rifle, a Winchester, and fired. The shot was fast. It was also high. The bullet sang over their heads, a sharp, angry wasp. "Get behind the rock." Jonah ordered Ellie. He did not move. He unholstered his own Colt, holding it in his right hand. "You should have died in the pass," Hut shrieked, fumbling to lever another round. "Crowell wants you dead." "And he sent you," Jonah called back, his voice calm, conversational. He was closing the distance, walking slowly, not in a straight line, but in a weaving, unpredictable path. "I will kill you!" Hut fired again. The bullet kicked up dust 10 feet to Jonah's left. He was a good shot with a rifle, but he was panicked. A pistol at this range was useless. A rifle, in the hands of a calm man, would have ended it. Hut was not calm. "You cut the water, Hut!" Jonah called, still walking. "A coward's move." "It is Crowell's land," Hut screamed. He fired again, wildly. "It is all Crowell's." Hut looked at the tall, bandaged man walking toward him. A man who should have been dead, a man who did not seem to fear his rifle. He looked at the setting sun. He lost his nerve. He ran for his horse. He jammed his foot into the stirrup, grabbed the horn, and swung himself up. He kicked the horse, hard, and it bolted. But he did not ride away. He rode at them, his rifle now held in one hand like a pistol. He was going to ride them down. "Get down!" Jonah yelled, shoving Ellie back. The horse, a big, powerful animal, was thundering toward them. Hut was screaming, a high, thin sound of rage and fear. Jonah did not shoot at Hut. He waited, his face a grim, patient mask. He waited until the horse was just 30 yards away, and then he raised the Colt and fired. He shot the ground, just in front of the horse's pounding hooves. The horse, already spooked, saw the puff of dust and the flash of fire. It screamed, planting its feet, and spun on its haunches in a violent, twisting buck. Hut was not expecting it. He was a heavy man. He lost his grip on the rifle. He lost his seat, and he was thrown. He sailed through the air, a clumsy, sprawling shape, and landed hard on the unforgiving rock. He rolled, and for a second, he just lay still. Then, he moved. He pushed himself up, his leg at a strange, unnatural angle. He had landed badly. He reached for his rifle, which had skittered 10 feet away. Jonah was on him. He kicked the rifle away, sending it spinning over the edge of the mesa. He stood over Hut, the Colt now leveled at the man's head. Hut stared up the barrel, his face pale, his breath coming in sobs. "Do not," he gasped. "Please, God, do not." Ellie ran up, her own pistol in her hand. He is hurt," she said. Jonah looked at the man who had tried to kill them, who had tried to burn a child, who had cut their water, who had been part of the force that had destroyed his life. He saw the terror in Hut's eyes. He saw the broken, pathetic man. And he remembered the fire. He remembered his sister. He remembered the smell of burning. He lowered the pistol. "Get up," Jonah said, his voice flat. I cannot," Hut whimpered, clutching his leg. "It is broke. I think it is broke." Jonah holstered his Colt. He turned his back on the man. "Ellie," he said, the rope from his saddle. Ellie, her hands shaking, fumbled with the rope on Hut's horse, which now stood trembling, its sides heaving. She brought the rope to Jonah. He did not waste time. He tied Hut's hands behind his back, a quick, efficient job. He tied his feet. Then, with a grunt of pain from his own arm, He lifted the heavy man, slung him over the saddle of his own horse, and tied him down. He had not killed him. He had not left him. He had captured him. He had chosen the paper law, even here, on this high, lonely mesa. As he was securing the last knot, Hut, his face upside down and white with pain, blurted, "You are a dead man. Navajo. You do not know. You do not know what you are doing, Crowell. He will not let this go to a trial. He cannot."
"He will,"
Ellie said, her voice hard. "We have the receipt." Hut laughed, a gurgling, painful sound.
"The receipt. You think this is about a barn, you stupid,"
he gasped. "This is not about the barn. It is about the canyon campaign." Jonah stopped. He turned, his face dark. "What did you say?"
"The campaign,"
Hut spat, his eyes wild with fear and pain. "After your people were moved, the army sent patrols. Crowell, he was a civilian scout. He led a cleanup, a private campaign. He wants you silenced. He thought you were one of the ones who got away. He thought you remembered." Ellie looked at Jonah. His face was gray. He looked, for a second, like a man who had seen a ghost. The massacre, the old stories. It was not just land. It was this. Crowell was cleaning up his own bloody history. Jonah said nothing. He finished his knot. He took the reins of Hut's horse. He looked at Ellie. "We will lead him. It will be dark soon." They walked back, leading the prisoner. The sun setting, the sky a bruised purple. The night was quiet. The trial was tomorrow. They reached the ranch in the deep, velvet darkness. They put Hut, groaning, in the feed room, the one place with a solid door and no windows, and gave him water. Then they were alone in the yard. The silence was immense. The crisis of the water, the chase, the terrible revelation. It all hung in the air. The stars were out, a cold, indifferent glitter.
"Jonah,"
Ellie began, her voice small. He was standing under the tall cottonwood trees by the dry creek, his back to her. He was looking at the dark line of the mesas. "He was a scout," Jonah said, his voice a low, empty thing. "They were not soldiers. They were volunteers. They were paid a bounty. For scalps." He touched his own hair. "They called it cleaning up. I was at the school. I did not know." "You did not know him?" Ellie asked, stepping closer. "I knew the story," he said. "The canyon campaign. A thing of ghosts." He turned to her. His face, in the starlight, was a map of old pain. "He has been hunting me all this time, not for a horse, not for land. He wants to erase the memory." "We will tell the magistrate," Ellie said, her voice fierce. "We will tell them all." "They will not believe," he said. "It is a Navajo's word against a white man's paper. Then we will make them believe," she said. She was standing in front of him now. She could feel the heat from his body, the tension in him, the deep, shuddering exhaustion. He was a man holding the world up by the strength of his one good arm. She looked at him, at this man who had walked into fire, who had refused to kill, who had brought her ranch back to life, and who was now standing on the edge of a past too terrible to hold. "You are afraid," she whispered. He did not deny it. "I am not afraid of him," he said, his voice a rasp. "I am afraid of the forgetting. If he dies, if I die, it will be like it never happened." "I will not forget," she said. She reached up, her hand cool, and touched his face, the rough skin, the scar. He flinched, then leaned into her touch. He was trembling. "You are shaking," she said. "My arm," he said, but it was not his arm. It was his soul. She put her other hand on his good shoulder, feeling the hard, coiled muscle. She stood on her toes, and she rested her forehead against his. Skin to skin, she closed her eyes. "Press into me," she whispered, her breath a small, warm thing in the cool air. "Let me hold some of it," You do not have to hold it all. He did not move for a long second. Then, a sound, a low groan, came from his chest. His good arm came up, circling her, pulling her against him. He was a man drowning, and she was the first solid land he had touched. He pressed his forehead back against hers, his eyes closed, his whole body shuddering with the release of a tension he had held for a lifetime. He buried his face in her hair, his hand tangling in it. "Always," he murmured, and the word was a promise, a prayer. They just stood there, holding each other, under the silent trees. It was not a fire, it was a well. It was deep, and it was cool, and it was life. He held her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition. It was a kiss that said, "You are real, I am real, we are here." After a long time, he drew back. He was still holding her. The shaking had stopped. He reached into the small pouch at his belt, the one he always wore. He pulled out a small, sharp thing. He pressed it into her hand. It was a stone, an arrowhead, but it was not dark. It was a milky white, smooth and cool. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough. "White quartz. It is for seeing in the dark, for protection, for connection." Ellie closed her hand around it. The stone was warm from his body. She looked at it, then at him. She saw a small hole, drilled at the base. She went into the house. She came back a moment later, the arrowhead tied on a thin, leather cord. She did not hesitate. She lifted her hair, and her hands shook as she tied it around her neck. The stone fell, cool and solid, against her skin, beneath her dress. It was a secret. It was a promise. "It is we now," she said, her hand over the place where the stone lay. "Not you and me. It is we. We will face them tomorrow. We will tell them what we know." He looked at her, the arrowhead hidden, but he knew it was there, resting against her heart. He took her hand, the one that was not over the stone. He did not kiss her again. He just held her hand. It was enough. It was everything. The day of the market court dawned cold. The rain from the barn raising had been a brief, false promise. Now the air was dry again, and a hot, uneasy wind was blowing from the east, carrying the smell of the deep desert, of grit and time. Ellie and Jonah rode into Drywell. They did not ride in defeat. Jonah, his burned arm in its linen sling, sat tall on the gelding. Ellie rode her mare beside him. Behind them, tethered, was Hut's horse, and slumped over its saddle, his hands and feet bound, his broken leg a screaming agony, was Ray Hut. They did not ride to the sheriff's. They rode straight down the main street. The town was already full for the market day. When people saw the procession, the widow, the Navajo warrior, and the bound, groaning captive, a hush fell. It was a silence so profound, it swallowed the wind. They stopped in front of the church. The church was serving as the courtroom, as it often did when the traveling magistrate, Judge Thorne, was in town. Thorne was a hard man, an ex-soldier who believed in God and the letter of the law, and he was not known to be swayed by men like Crowell. Ellie dismounted. Jonah swung down, his face a grim, set mask. He untied Hut, handling the heavy, groaning man with a rough, pained competence, and slung him over his good shoulder. He carried Hut up the church steps and deposited him on the porch, where he slumped against a post, whimpering. "He cut our water pipe, Sheriff," Ellie said, her voice clear, as McCaffrey came running from his office. "He was on my land. We brought him in." McCaffrey stared, his face a mixture of fear and, for the first time, a kind of grudging respect. "Ellie, Mrs. Hart, you just brought him in." "The court is in 10 minutes, Jonah said, his voice flat. "He is a material witness and a prisoner." They walked into the church. It was packed. Every homesteading family that had been at the barn raising was there. The Garretts, with little Emma, the Olsons, their faces like carved, serious wood. Tommy Blake, sitting near the front. But the other side was there, too. Reverend Pike stood near the lectern, his Bible in hand, whispering to a cluster of the town's more righteous ladies, including Mrs. Patterson. His face was pale, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. And on the front pew, sitting as if he owned the building, which, in a way, he did. As he held the note for its roof was Silas Crowell. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a black suit and a string tie. He looked calm, powerful, and utterly unconcerned. When he saw Ellie and Jonah walk in, he did not even turn. He simply watched their reflection in the window glass, a small, cold smile on his lips. Judge Thorne entered, a tall, gaunt man with a face like a hatchet. He slammed his gavel on the lectern. "This court of the Arizona Territory is now in session," he boomed. "First matter, the petition of Mrs. Eleanor Hart for an injunction against the foreclosure on her property by Mr. Silas Crowell." A murmur went through the room. "Mr. Finch," the judge said. Mr. Finch, his hands shaking so hard he could barely hold his papers, stood up. "Your Honor, we petition on the grounds of criminal conspiracy, bad faith, and a pattern of intimidation, arson, and attempted murder on the part of the plaintiff, Mr. Crowell, and his agent, Mr. Ray Hutt." The room exploded. Crowell's head snapped around, his smile gone. "Libel," he roared, jumping to his feet. "This is an outrage, this hysterical female." "Sit down, Mr. Crowell," Judge Thorne said, his voice a whip crack. "You will have your turn, as of now. You are a party to this hearing, not its master. Continue, Mr. Finch." Finch, emboldened, took a breath. "I call Mrs. Eleanor Hart." Ellie walked to the front, her head high. She told the story. The 30-day note, the dead rat, the riders with torches, and she told them about the ambush in the pass, after the auction. "They left backward horseshoe prints, Your Honor, to fool us." "And you have proof of this?" Thorne asked. "My word, sir," Ellie said. Reverend Pike snorted. "The word of a woman who consorts." "Silence," Thorne roared, "or I will have you removed for contempt. Reverend, I will weigh the words." He looked at Ellie. "Continue." "And," Ellie said, her voice gaining strength, "we have this." She placed the greasy receipt on the lectern. "A receipt for 5 gallons of kerosene bought by Ray Hutt on the day the Garrett barn burned down, with a forged signature, to hide his crime." A gasp. Jim Garrett stood up. He burned my barn." "Sit down, Mr. Garrett," Thorne yelled. He picked up the receipt, sniffing it. "This is a serious charge. Mrs. Hart." "I call Mr. Tommy Blake." Finch said. Tommy walked up, his face pale but determined. He testified clearly. He had found the receipt. He knew Hutt's signature from the mercantile ledgers. This was not it. It was a forgery. The room was buzzing. Crowell was on his feet again, his face purple. "This is a farce, a boy, a delinquent woman. You are taking their word, against mine." "No, Mr. Crowell," Finch said, his voice surprisingly steady. "We are not—" He turned. "I call Mr. Jonah Nez." The silence was a physical thing. It was a vacuum. Every person in the room stopped breathing. Reverend Pike gripped his Bible so hard his knuckles were white. Jonah stood. He unstrapped his Colt and left it on the pew. He walked to the front, his arm in its sling, his moccasins silent on the floorboards. He stood before the magistrate, not as a prisoner, not as a savage, but as a man. "Mr. Nez," Finch said. Can you tell the court what you saw on the night of October 12th? Jonah turned, not to the judge, but to the people, to the Garretts, the Olsons, his new allies. I saw fire, he said, his voice low, but it filled the small church. I saw a man. He had a can. He was running from the Garrett barn. Just as the hay caught, he ran to a horse and rode away. And do you see that man in this room? Finch asked. Jonah turned his head, slowly. He looked at Silas Crowell. He looked at Reverend Pike. And then he looked at the door, at the man slumped on the porch. He is not in the room. Jonah said, He is on the porch. His name is Ray Hutt. He is the man I saw. And, Finch pressed, his voice rising, did you not engage Mr. Hutt this morning? Yes, Jonah said. He came to our ranch in the night. He sawed through our water pipe. He tried to kill our horses. We tracked him. We found him on the mesa. You tracked him? The judge asked, leaning forward. Yes, Jonah said. He tried to kill me. He had a rifle. I had a pistol. He fired 4, maybe 5 times. He paused. I did not kill him. I did not leave him on the mesa to die. I shot his hand. I brought him here. For you. For the paper law. The room was dead silent. The simplicity of it, the raw morality, was a blow. This man, this savage, had offered his enemy more justice than any of them. And he confessed, Ellie said, standing up. He said Crowell wanted him silenced because of the Canyon campaign. He said Crowell, he was a scout. Lies, Crowell roared. He was a different man now. The mask was off. His face was a mask of terror. She is mad. He is a liar. This is... He never finished. As he roared, a signal was given. From the street. A shout. Fire! The jail is on fire! And then the sound of gunfire. Not one shot, but 6, 7. A volley. The church exploded. People screamed, diving for the exit. Mrs. Patterson fainted. Reverend Pike began to pray, loudly. The end of days, the judgment is upon us. Order, Judge Thorne roared, pulling a pistol from under his robe. Order. But Crowell was moving. He was not moving toward the panic. He was moving toward the side door, a small, satisfied smirk back on his face. His men were here. Sheriff, Ellie screamed. He is getting away. Sheriff McCaffrey had been standing by the main door, his face pale, his hand on his gun. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, his job and his fear. He saw Crowell moving. He saw the smirk. He saw the gunfire in the street, a clear, coordinated distraction. He saw the faces of Olson and Garrett, who were looking at him with utter contempt. And he made his choice. He strode across the church, drawing his revolver. He did not go for the gunman. He planted himself between Silas Crowell and the door. Stand still, Silas, McCaffrey said, his voice shaking, but his gun steady. This is a court of law, and you are a party to this hearing. Crowell stopped. His face was a mask of disbelief. You are a fool, McCaffrey. You are finished. Maybe, the sheriff said. But you are not leaving. Outside, the chaos was real. 6 men. All hard cases from the Prescott Saloon were in the street, their guns out. Get the prisoner, one yelled, riding toward the church. We are here for Hutt. But the valley had not come to just watch. They had come to fight. From the roof of the Mercantile, a rifle cracked. It was a heavy .50 caliber round. The shot hit the dust in front of the lead rider's horse, kicking up a shower of dirt. The horse screamed and reared. Get out! Lars Olson's voice boomed from the roof. This is our town. The gunmen, stunned, looked up. They saw Olson. They saw Jim Garrett in the alleyway, his shotgun level. They saw Tommy Blake and 2 other homesteaders, armed and ready. Jonah had not panicked. At the first sound of gunfire, he had retrieved his Colt. He moved to the main doorway, scanning the street. He saw Hutt, still on the porch, trying to use a small knife to cut his bonds. One of the gunmen, the one who had shot at Jonah in the pass, saw him. He recognized him. "It is the Navajo," he screamed, his face a mask of hate. He leveled his rifle. "This time, you die." He fired. The bullet splintered the door frame, sending shards of wood into Jonah's face. Jonah did not flinch. He stepped out onto the porch, his good hand, his right hand, at his side. The Colt held low. The gunman laughed, levering another round. "You are dead." From the ground, Hutt, who had gotten his boot free, twisted. He had a small derringer. He fired it at Jonah. The shot was wild, a pop in the middle of the greater noise. The gunman on the horse was steadying his rifle for the killing shot. Jonah moved. It was not a fast draw. It was a smooth, economical, beautiful piece of motion. He raised his arm. He fired. He did not aim for the chest. He did not aim for the head. He aimed for the threat. His bullet struck the gunman's right hand. The rifle exploded in a shower of metal and splintered wood. The man screamed, a high, thin sound, clutching the bloody ruin of his hand. The fight was over. The other gunmen, seeing their leader disarmed by a one-armed man, seeing the rifles on the roofs and in the alleys, threw down their guns. "We quit," one yelled, raising his hands. "We are just paid for the day." Back in the church, Crowell had seen it all. His face was the color of ash. "It is over, Silas," the sheriff said, taking his gun. "It is, Mr. Crowell," a new voice said. It was Mr. Evans, the mercantile clerk. He was shaking from head to toe, but he was holding the store's thick, black ledger. I could not, Your Honor, not after what he did, not after what Mr. Nez did." He stumbled forward and handed the book to Judge Thorne. He made me write it down. He said he liked to keep clean books. Page 44. Costs for barn fire. And page 51. Payment to Prescott Bank for heart note consideration. It was all there. The bank bribe, the money for the arson. Judge Thorne looked at the ledger. He looked at Crowell, who had collapsed onto a pew. A broken man. He slammed his gavel. "This court," he roared, "finds sufficient evidence of a vast and monstrous conspiracy. I am hereby issuing a temporary injunction, freezing the foreclosure on the Hart Ranch indefinitely, pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal." He pointed at Hutt, who was now being tended to by Dr. Blake. "Mr. Hutt is remanded to the custody of the sheriff, to be held without bail for arson and attempted murder." He pointed at Crowell. "Mr. Silas Crowell, you are a disgrace to this territory. Your gunmen are prisoners. Your books betray you. I am ordering you to surrender all your firearms. You will remain in Dry Well, under house arrest. And God have mercy on your soul when the marshal gets here." It was over. A great sigh went up from the crowd. And then the world went dark. The wind, which had been a threat, became a reality. A low, moaning shriek filled the air. The light in the church turned a sick, brownish yellow. "Sandstorm!" Lars Olsen roared from the doorway. "She is a big one, everyone. Inside seal the doors." It was as if nature herself was slamming the gavel. A wall of roiling, brown dust, 1,000 feet high, hit the town. The wind shrieked, a sound of pure, elemental rage. Everyone, the heroes, the villains, the saved, the damned, piled back into the small church. They slammed the heavy wooden doors, bracing them with a pew. Dust seeped under the cracks, filling the air, stinging their eyes, coating their throats. The building groaned, the wind trying to tear it apart. In the choking yellow gloom, the people of Drywell huddled together. The magistrate, the reverend, the gunmen, now prisoners, the Olsons, the Garretts, Crowell, A defeated giant, weeping in a corner.
Ellie, coughing in the dust, felt a hand find hers. It was Jonah's. His good hand, strong and calloused, found her, and he held on. She held on back. He was the anchor. She was the anchor. They stood together in the heart of the storm. The community, their faces streaked with dust and sweat, looked at them. They were not looking at a widow and a savage. They were looking at two people who had stood, who had fought, and who had won. They were looking at the beginning of something new. They were looking at hope. The storm lasted for 3 hours, a screaming, suffocating eternity. Inside the church, they were a single, huddled mass, bound not by faith but by the howling wind. Dust was a thick, gritty fog that coated every surface, filled every lung. In the yellow gloom, enemies became just other people, coughing in the dark. When it finally passed, it did not end. It simply moved on. A great, angry beast, leaving a pulverized silence in its wake. Lars Olsen and Jim Garrett, their faces caked with dust, unbarred the door. The world they looked out on was scoured, changed. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue. The town of Drywell was buried. Drifts of fine, yellow sand piled against buildings like snow. Judge Thorne was the first to act. He stepped out onto the porch, his black robes covered in dust, and he looked like a prophet from a ruined land. He looked at Sheriff McCaffrey. "Sheriff," he boomed, his voice hoarse, "your town is a mess, but the law is clean." He pointed to Crowell, who was a slumped, broken figure on the pew. "Secure your prisoner. Secure Mr. Hutt and his gunmen. I am riding for Prescott at once. I will see the territorial marshal myself." He turned to Mr. Evans, the clerk. "And you, sir, will come with me. You and that ledger. You are a material witness." The legal consequences were as swift as the storm. Sheriff McCaffrey, a changed man, a man who had finally chosen his side, did not waver. He sent a telegraph to the territorial court. His message a stark report of the judge's findings and the capture of Crowell's private army. The bank in Prescott, faced with a federal investigation and the damning ledger, did not hesitate. The manager who had approved the acceleration of Ellie's note was fired within a day. A new man was sent down, a thin, nervous man with instructions to cooperate fully with Mrs. Hart. The foreclosure was not just frozen, it was dead. And Silas Crowell, his power a pile of dust like the drifts in the street, was taken to the jail. He was no longer a spider. He was just a man in a cell, waiting to be taken away. The social healing began the same way the trouble had with work, the morning after the storm. Ellie and Jonah rode back to the ranch. The world was raw, the air clean and sharp. The cut pipe was still there, a monument to a fight that was already over. They were standing by the well, staring at the useless pump. When the wagon rattled up, it was Lars Olsen. Tommy Blake sat beside him. The wagon bed was not empty. It held a 6-foot length of new, shining metal pipe and a collection of tools. "The wind, she makes a mess," Lars said, by way of greeting. He did not ask if they needed help. He simply climbed down. "It's hard to find good pipe. This I had for my own well, but my well is not cut." Tommy Blake jumped down, his face bright. "Mr. Olsen and we figured this was the first job. Mrs. Hart, Mr. Nez." Jonah looked at the pipe, then at Lars. He nodded. "Once." "Is good pipe," he said. The four of them worked. It was not easy. The ground was rocky, the pipe heavy. Jonah, his arm still in the sling, directed, his one good hand showing Tommy how to seat the gaskets. Lars, with his massive strength, held the pipe steady. Ellie, her skirts hiked up, worked beside them, her hands greasy, her face set in concentration. They were wrenching the last joint tight when a carriage appeared. It was a fine, black carriage. The
the kind that never came out this far. It stopped, and Mrs. Prudence Patterson stepped down. She was not dressed for a social call. She was dressed in a plain, gray dress. She looked, Ellie thought, like she was attending a funeral. Mrs. Patterson walked up the dusty hill, her fine shoes ruined. She stopped 10 feet from Ellie. She looked at Ellie's greasy hands, at her skirt tied up, at the men working. "Mrs. Hart," she said, her voice tight, brittle. I have come." Ellie stood up, wiping her hand on her skirt, which only made it worse. She waited. "I am a proud woman, Mrs. Hart." "Mrs.," Patterson said, staring at a rock. "And I have been a fool, a terrible, unchristian fool." She finally looked at Ellie, and her eyes were wet. "The Reverend Pike, he spoke of sin, he spoke of darkness, but the darkness, it was in us, in me." She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a clean, linen handkerchief. She did not use it. "What you did, what you both did." She looked at Jonah, who had stopped work and was watching her, his face unreadable. "It was righteous, and I stood against you." She took a deep breath. "I have come to apologize, to beg your forgiveness. My husband has been instructed to extend your credit at the bank, indefinitely." Ellie looked at this proud, broken woman. "There is nothing to forgive, Mrs. Patterson," Ellie said, her voice quiet. "The town was afraid. We were all afraid." "Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "You were not—" She turned to Jonah. She did not speak to him as a savage. She spoke to him as a man. "Mr. Nez," she said, and she inclined her head, a gesture of profound respect. "My home would be honored if you would ever be our guest." She did not wait for an answer. She turned, her shoulders straight, and marched back to her carriage, a woman who had just performed the hardest act of her life. "Well," Tommy Blake said, his voice full of wonder, "that is that." Lars Olsen spat. "Is good," he said. Just as the carriage pulled away, another rider came up. It was Jim Garrett. He swung down from his horse, his daughter Emma in front of him. He set her on the ground and she ran, not to Ellie, but straight to Jonah. "Mr. Smoke Angel," she yelled, throwing her small arms around his legs. Jonah froze. He looked down at the child clinging to him, his face a mask of shock. Then, slowly, his good hand came up and rested on her head, a gentle, protective gesture. "Emma," Garrett said, his voice thick. He walked over. "Mr. Nez, Mrs. Hart, I came to tell you, the new barn, it needs a top hand. It needs someone who knows joinery and horses, and I will not trust anyone else." He stuck his hand out to Jonah. "I told the town, any hand of Jonah Nez is welcome at my table. I am here to make it official. Work, wages, partnership, whatever you want. You have a place in this valley." Jonah looked at Garrett's outstretched hand. He looked at the child clinging to his leg. He looked at Ellie. He gently unpeeled Emma, who giggled, and took Garrett's hand. "I have work here," Jonah said, "but the valley, it is good." Lars Olsen stood up. "The pipe is set." He walked to the pump. He looked at Ellie, then at Jonah. "Is your well," he said to her, "but is his water?" He nodded to Jonah. You pump first." Jonah stepped to the handle. He took it in his good hand. He pushed down. Once, twice. A deep, wet groan. A third time. A great gush of water, thick and muddy, shot from the spout. He kept pumping. The water turned. It coughed. And then it ran clear. A powerful, silvery stream arched out in the afternoon light, splashing on the stones. Emma, shrieking with delight, ran into the stream. The well was back. The life was back. That night, as the sun went down, the water from the trough
which was overflowing, caught the last rays of light. It looked, Ellie thought, like a stream of liquid silver. She and Jonah stood on the porch, watching it. "The land remembers," she whispered, echoing his words. "And it forgives," he said, his voice quiet. The healing of the ranch was the healing of the valley. The next month was a blur of work. The town, energized by the fall of Crowell and the victory, poured its energy into rebuilding. They organized a roping and riding social, a big informal gathering at the new Garrett barn. It was not a party. It was a statement of community. Ellie and Jonah went. They were not guests. They were the center. The social was a new world. Ellie, who had been a pariah, was now surrounded by the townswomen, who were asking her advice on gardening, on mending. She found herself, almost by accident, setting up a small reading circle, using her old books to teach Mrs. Olson and 2 other homestead wives how to read the labels at the mercantile. Jonah was not on the side. Jim Garrett and Lars Olson brought him into the circle of men. His burned arm was healing, the scars raw and red, but his hand was strong. He did not rope, but he stood by the corral, and the children, led by Tommy Blake, gathered around him. He did not teach them to fight. He took a stick and drew in the dirt. He taught them the track of a deer, the track of a coyote. He taught them how to read the land. Reverend Pike was not there. He was, they said, in prayer, and his congregation had dwindled to 3, including his wife. That night, they rode home under a full moon, the sound of a fiddle from the party following them for a mile. They sat on the porch, the silence, comfortable, familiar. "You know," Ellie said, her voice soft, "I was so afraid. When Jacob died, I was afraid of being alone. And then, when you came, I was afraid of not being alone." Jonah waited, watching her, his patience a physical, comforting thing. "Tonight," she continued, "I was teaching Greta to read flower, and I was happy, truly happy. And then I felt guilty. I felt like I was forgetting him, like I was letting his memory die." She touched the small, hidden arrowhead at her throat. "I was afraid that to care for you was to betray him." Jonah was silent for a long time. He looked up at the moon, at the same indifferent sky. "In my village," he said, his voice a low rumble, "we do not bury the dead and walk away. We keep them. We keep their stories. We keep their memory in our hands, in our work. When I build a fence, I build it with the memory of my father, who taught me to notch wood." He turned to her, his dark eyes soft in the moonlight. "Your heart, Ellie, it is not a small room. It is not a room that can only hold one man. It is a large house. It has room for your grief, and for your husband's memory. And it has room—" He paused. "For other things." He reached out, not with his hand, but with his words. "Love does not erase memory. Ellie, it does not push it out. It finds a place for it. It helps the memory find peace. It helps it to rest." Ellie felt the tears she had not shed, the tears of guilt, finally fall. "I do not want him to be gone," she whispered. "He is not gone," Jonah said. "He is in the posts of the fence. He is in the foundation of this house. He is here, and he is at peace, because you are safe." She looked at him, at his strong, scarred face, and she knew he was right. "The ranch," she said, her voice suddenly clear, changing the subject, but not really. "It is ours. Jonah, we saved it, but the paper, the deed, it is still in my name. It is in heart." "It is your land," he said. "No," she said, and she stood up, full of a new, fierce clarity. "It is not anymore. It is our land. I have been thinking, that lawyer, Mr. Finch, he is a good man. I'm going to have him draw up a paper." Jonah stood up, wary. A paper marriage. No, Ellie said, laughing. A real free laugh. Not yet. A better paper. A stronger paper. I am not a woman who needs a husband. Jonah Nez. I am a woman who needs a partner. She stood before him, her eyes shining. I want to form a company, the Hart Nez Ranch. 50-50. We will write it down. Shared risk, shared labor, shared profit. The land will be ours. The horses will be ours. The debt and the future will be ours. No more you and me. No more my ranch. Just us. He stared at her. He, who had been sold for $50, was now being offered everything. Not as a gift, as a partnership. He did not smile, but his eyes were bright. Hart Nez Ranch, he said, tasting the words. It is a good name. Then it is settled, she said. The next day, they did not just plan for survival. They planned for a future. Ellie, with her new line of credit, bought seed. Jonah, with Tommy Blake's help, began to repair the broken section of the pipe, reinforcing it, and building a new, higher tower for the cistern, one that would hold more water. They got a letter. It was from Dr. Blake. He had spoken to the quartermaster at the Army fort in Prescott. They needed horses. Good, strong horses. Broken for the rough country. They were willing to pay a high price. They were willing to sign a contract. Ellie and Jonah stood by the new, strong fence, the contract in her hand. They looked out at the valley, their valley. The garden was sprouting green shoots. The horses were healthy. And at the well, the pump, newly painted, its spout pointed to the trough, was ready. The water was waiting. The contract with the Army changed everything. It was not just money, though it was more money than Ellie had ever seen. It was respect. It was a line of ink on paper that said the Hart Nez Ranch was a legitimate, professional operation. The contracts, the ones she had taught Jonah to read, had become their shield, and now their sword. The work was a hard, driving rhythm that carried them through the winter. They bought feed with the Army's advance. They bought 2 new strong mares, and they hired Tommy Blake full-time. He was, to his father's mild dismay, a born horseman, not a doctor. The news from Prescott, from the territorial capital, came in the early spring, delivered by Sheriff McCaffrey himself. He did not send a deputy. He rode out to the ranch, his hat in his hand, a thick envelope bearing the official seal. Mrs. Hart, Mr. Nez, he said, standing by the new water tower they had built. It is final. The territorial court has handed down its judgment. Ellie took the papers, but looked at him. Tell us, Sheriff, she said. McCaffrey cleared his throat. Silas Crowell, he read, has been found guilty on all counts, conspiracy, bribery, arson, and on the information Mr. Nez provided, additional counts related to his time as a civilian scout during the Canyon Campaign. They found another witness, an old soldier, who confirmed his cleanup operations. Jonah closed his eyes. His past, the ghosts. They had finally been given a name in a white man's court. He has been sentenced to 20 years hard labor at the territorial prison. McCaffrey said, He is gone. Ellie, he will not be back. He continued, The court has voided all his land seizures. Every homestead he took through fraud is being returned to its original owners. Or, he looked at the paper. In cases where the owners are gone, that land, thousands of acres, is being forfeit. Forfeit to whom? Ellie asked. To the territory, McCaffrey said, a small, strange smile on his face. And the court has ordered a portion of it, the part nearest to Drywell, to be sold with all proceeds, and I quote, to establish a local school fund for the education of all children, without prejudice. Ellie looked at Jonah. A school, a real one. not just for the white children, but for all. The legacy of their fight was not just land. It was a future. Drywell changed. It grew. The railroad, seeing that Crowell's grip was broken, finally pushed a spur line through. With the new line came new people, but they were not the old kind. They were families. They were people like the Olsons, coming to build, not to take. Reverend Pike's power, built on fear, dissolved like a sand drift in the wind. His congregation, ashamed of their part in the town's sickness, simply stopped coming. He left one day on the eastbound train, his face as gray as the dust. The church building, however, did not stay empty. Mrs. Patterson, in an act of penance that redeemed her in the eyes of the valley, bought the note from the bank. She did not turn it into a house of judgment. She, along with Ellie and Greta Olson, turned it into the new schoolhouse. By day, a teacher hired by the new fund taught the children. By night, 2 nights a week. Ellie Hart stood at the front, a piece of chalk in her hand, teaching her neighbors, Anglo and Scandinavian, and when a few Dine families came down from the mesas to trade, them as well, she taught them to read contract and deed and flower. The barn raising became a tradition. Every spring, the valley gathered. Not because a barn had burned, but to build, they built a new smithy. They built a new meeting hall. They built, as Lars Olson said, with good joinery. Their hands and their labor a shared, yearly promise. The Hartnett Ranch prospered. It became a stopping point, a place of known quality. Jonah's understanding of horses, his quiet, firm methods, became legendary. The Army contract doubled. They bought the adjoining land, the good pasture that Crowell had coveted, buying it legally from the Territorial Fund. The ranch house was no longer just a house. It was a home. It became a meeting place. Dine traders, wary at first, soon learned that the man called Jonah Nez and the woman with the arrowhead at her throat spoke true. They came to trade, their wagons sitting in the yard beside Lars Olson's, their language mingling with his thick Swedish and Ellie's clear English. It was a place where labor was the only currency that mattered. One afternoon, a year after the trial, a year of peace and hard, fulfilling work, a wagon from a Mexican silversmith came through. He was on his way to Santa Fe. Jonah, his arm now a map of livid, healed scars, stopped him. He did not buy a grand, ornate thing. He traded a good pony for 2 simple, heavy bands of silver, hammered flat, as plain and strong as the land itself. He did not plan a ceremony. He did not ask a preacher. That evening, as the sun was setting, turning the mesas a deep, bruised purple, he and Ellie walked to the grove of cottonwood trees by the creek. The water was running now. A small, steady stream from a spring he had cleared high in the hills. They stood under the trees, the sound of the water and the wind in the leaves the only witnesses. "I have no words," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble. He held out the ring. "This is not a chain, Ellie. It is not a paper law. It is a circle, like the well, like the seasons." Ellie was crying, but she was smiling. "I have no words either," she whispered. She took the other ring. "It is not a promise to obey. It is a promise to stand with you, like the fence, like the wall." He slid the cool, heavy silver onto her finger. She slid the matching one onto his. They did not kiss, not at first. They just held hands, the metal new and strange, a solid weight binding them. "I am still me," she said, a small note of fear in her voice. "I am still Ellie Hart." "I am still Jonah Nez," he said. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed the ring, then her skin. I would not have it any other way. The next morning, Ellie woke to the sound of a soft, rhythmic tapping. She came out onto the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand. Jonah was on a small stool by the doorway. He was not working on the house. He was working on a memory. He was hanging the white quartz arrowhead, her arrowhead, the one she had worn for a year. on a new leather cord, just above the lintel of the door. "What are you doing?" she asked, a smile in her voice. "That is mine." "It was," he said, not looking up from his work. "It was yours, to protect you, now." He tied the final, intricate knot. "It is ours, to protect this house." He stood back. The white stone, a sharp, pure shape, glinted in the morning sun. A stark, beautiful contrast to the dark wood. "A home," he said, "must be open, but it must be safe." He touched the stone. "This home is now open for the thirsty traveler. It is a place of water and of rest." She came and stood beside him, her shoulder pressing against his arm. She looked at the arrowhead, then at him. "And what about me?" she said, her voice light. "What will I wear?" He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, new thing, another piece of quartz, this one a pale rose color, that he had found by the spring. It was smaller, warmer. "We have more than one memory," he said. The land healed. That summer, the rains came, not as a storm, but as a long, steady, life-giving blessing. The dust was washed from the leaves. The land, which had been gray and brown, turned a deep, impossible green overnight. And with the rain came the new life. The army contract had led them to buy a fine stallion, and in the high pasture, a new generation of foals was running. They were long-legged, clumsy, and full of a bright, burning energy. Their small chests were shiny in the sun, their futures as wide and open as the sky. Ellie and Jonah often sat on the porch in the evenings, the day's work done, the partnership papers safe in their tin box. They would watch the sky change, a comfortable silence between them, the two silver rings on their hands catching the last light. He looked at her one night, her head resting on her hand, a ledger open in her lap. He felt a surge of not just love, not just possession. It was a feeling of profound, deep and quiet rightness. He thought of his old life and hers, of the fire and the fever. He knew they did not belong to each other, not like a horse or a piece of land or a thing bought with paper. He knew, as he watched her, that they were two people, whole and separate. They were two trails, starting from different, hard places, and they had met here, in the dust. They had not merged. They had chosen, of their own free will, to run alongside each other, to face the heat together, to cross the great, wide, and dangerous desert, and to build a home, a place of water, right in the middle of it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please leave a comment below to chat and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. You can also show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.